Now, David, we're going to move on to tax. Well, I seem to remember several months ago you discussing the issue of tax and particularly increasing the tax burden on at the upper levels of the tax spectrum, and suggesting that if the Scottish government or any other government increased taxes too high, that would encourage people to leave. Well, it looks like others agree because this is the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They've published an analysis of Scottish tax and benefit reforms. Well, here is a little bit from the press release. Tom Wernham, a research economist at IFS and an author of the report, said, the Scottish Government have used devolved income tax and benefit policy to make the system more progressive, as well as raise more revenue and fund public services. But it goes on to say, talking about high rate earners, with this group in particular, there's a risk that higher taxes will incentivize tax avoidance efforts or even incentivize migrating across the border. Well, I just thought that seemed to echo the concerns that you'd been expressing several months ago quite nicely.
Yes, and of course the bottom line has been that the tax take has been well below expectations, and that the Scottish Government has been bailed out by the UK taxpayer once again because all of the extra, they put the rates up, right? They've been able to say, oh, we've got the most progressive taxation system in Western Europe or whatever it happens to be. And they can guarantee that the supporters do not know that back in the 30s, progressive meant fascist. So they don't know that. They think progressive is some sort of good thing because it comes from the word progress. So that must be good. But in practice, what it means is they're taking in less tax. Right? They're failing in the very thing they set out to do, which is to gather money for all these allegedly good works by the state. And this also relates to this article I have here in the Telegraph regarding Rishi Sunak's taxation from Westminster. It's from John Monaghan, and it says its title is Rishi Sunak's tax hikes have a fundamental flaw. So he's saying that 8 years he wrote a piece for an online magazine, and he concluded that fiddling with tax rates would not have any impact at all on total tax revenue. Tax penalises economic activity, and if the penalty is increased, activity lessens and tax avoidance increases. Laffer and his famous curve came in for derision when it was first pointed this out, but it's now generally accepted that there's a tax rate that will maximise the tax take. They continued, they said 8 years later, I had a look at the results to see if it still held up. The UK's tax take is rock steady, just lower than Norway's he was talking about earlier, at around 34% of GDP. So whatever the individual tax rates have been set at in the interim, and it's a definition of madness to keep trying something that hasn't worked. So he's pointing out that basically we get 34% of GDP. The government can collect a maximum of 34% of GDP out of the UK society. That's all it's going to get. Right? They're kidding themselves if they think it's going to be more. And he finishes off, he said, the dynamic of why raising taxes lowers economic growth bears repeating. Take national insurance contributions and corporation tax. Increasing NIC places an extra cost on labour. When the NIC tax was imposed, one owner-manager of a 50-person business, and this is the sort of business that generates real job growth, observed to me, quote, well, that puts paid to 2 extra people I was going to hire next month. The extra national insurance contributions on the 50 employees he already had simply soaked up the money. Increasing corporation tax to 25% means companies will, again, have less money to grow their businesses and may relocate both new and existing investments out of the UK. And we have here just a quick reminder of what the Laffer Curve is. If you have 0% tax, you have zero tax revenue. If you have 100% tax, you have 0% tax revenue, because who would pay that? Who would work to pay all the revenue to the state? Somewhere in between, there's a tax revenue maximizing point. You go beyond that, then as the tax rate goes up, the actual tax total value brought in declines. And that's the lesson that it seems that neither the Holyrood nor the Westminster governments are really learning very quickly. A couple of other things on tax. BBC reports here Net zero targets may mean higher taxes. So here we've got an alleged economist who doesn't understand the Laffer Curve, Lord Nicholas Stern, who was an advisor to Tony Blair and to Boris Johnson. That was a clue. And he said that, quote, we must have growth, we must drive down emissions, and it's investment in the new technologies that is going to get us there. I'm not arguing for delaying investment in health and education. We have to pursue those at the same time. If we have to tax a little bit more, so be it. If we have to borrow a little bit more for the really tremendous investments, then we should do that. So tax, borrowing, it's all good. This is a sort of idiocy, economic illiteracy that is advising top politicians. It ignores the reality of the fact that you can't tax more no matter what you do, and it ignores the fact that borrowing is a big problem and the debt level's a big problem. They're of course trying to tax with stealth, because what do you do if you can't get any more? If you can't squeeze any more blood out of the stone, well, you try to do it without the stone noticing. So the Telegraph again, so 1 million more people are facing paying tax on savings. This relates to the fact that there's £1,000 tax-free allowance on interest from savings. Now the interest rates have gone up from basically 0 to 4%. People now have interest on their savings, and the tax-free allowance has not been corrected for inflation. So it's more and more people are losing that benefit and are being taxed on their savings, as that's another stealth tax. But still, they can't get any more than the 34%. Now, Mike, headlines you never thought you'd read. Sunak's tax blunders prove it. Liz Truss was right all along. It is said that if whatever politician leaves office, and no matter how you celebrate, you'll eventually miss them, because you'll be faced with the next one, which will be even worse. And I didn't know if that was going to be true of Liz Truss. I mean, how could it? But she's getting there. The return of Liz Truss to the political fray has sparked a barrage of derision and outrage. The former Prime Minister has been widely criticised for a 4,000-word essay in last weekend's Telegraph, followed by an hour-long interview on Spectator TV. Now, so she's been criticised for speaking out because they're trying to silence the former Prime Minister as well. And what she's saying that more tax doesn't help. Now, there is evidence for this, of course. She didn't make this particularly well when she was Prime Minister, but there's much evidence. So here we have the declining level of corporation tax year by year. It's a slightly skewed scale. It only goes down to 18, not to 0, but still, it dropped from 30% to 19%. A substantial reduction in corporation tax rate. In the same period, the actual tax take went up from 31 to 62 billion, so it doubled, and it went up from 2.4% of GDP to 2.9% of GDP. So actually we got more tax take with a lower rate. And this was a point that should have been made more clearly at the time, but this was the point underpinning Liz Truss's approach to taxation. Unfortunately, she didn't have an approach to cutting the size of the state, but, you know, she was half right. In the Telegraph, she was writing a 4,000-word essay. I was brought down by the left-wing economic establishment. There's a certain amount of sympathy you have to have, because she's saying, I assumed upon entering Downing Street my mandate would be respected. How wrong I was. This is quite an important point, because increasingly, as our politicians and as democracy loses authority, as it's shown to be weak and fraudulent and corrupt, mandates mean less and less. Liz Truss didn't get a mandate from the mass electorate. She got it through a leadership election only within the Tory party, and then the Tory party themselves didn't even respect that. So we're seeing the mandates don't mean as much as they used to, and her comments also, she was talking about the instinctive view of the Treasury regarding the economic orthodoxy, and they have essentially a pessimistic view of Britain, They viewed Brexit as damage limitation rather than a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And essentially, negative, small-minded, pessimistic views within the Treasury means that very little could be done. The Treasury was part of the problem, was the point she was making. And I think that particular narrative may have legs.
Okay, well, we'll watch and see what happens. But are you really supporting Liz Truss here, David?
Well, as I say, she was half right. We should be lowering taxes. We should also be cutting the size of the state. The idea that it's physically impossible to actually do the right thing in British government because the Treasury or other parts of the bureaucratic machine will stop you, I think is an interesting one. It also applies across where Mark is. Rather describes the experience of Donald Trump, I thought.
Okay, but just to finish this segment off, I mean, was her situation not that she didn't have the communication skills and the intellectual integrity actually to explain what she was trying to do?
Oh yes, I would agree with that. Right, there was a complete failure of communication skills, and there was a failure of bottle. Right, because when the pressure came on, she had one chance and only one chance to draw a line in the sand and say, "This is where we're going, right, and we're going there, or I'm off." And she could and should have done that, but she did the weak thing. She tried to negotiate. She tried to placate. She tried to appease the forces in the Treasury, and of course, the minute that started, she was toast. So yes, she did fail. At least in the way she failed because of her own actions. But the headwinds she faced, I think, are real enough.
Yeah.